Over the next several days, I returned to my normal fishing regimen. Initially, I made it a point to fish far from wherever he happened to be fishing, wishing only to forget the strange happenings of that day. But as time went on and the days turned to weeks, the memory of those events began to fade, and I found myself worrying less about his location and more about catching bass. Denial can be a very useful tool at times. As a whole, we gradually began to get used to his presence on the beach. Whether by the illumination of moonlight, the faint easterly light of false dawn, or the brassy light of the noonday sun, he always seemed to be there. He was like a bizarre permanent fixture on the rocks, placed there to spite us by the humorless hand of fate. During the infrequent times he wasn't fishing, he kept to himself mostly. The only contact we ever had with him was when he occasionally stopped by at Jim's bait and tackle for supplies. Even those encounters were brief, and he seemed not to pay any notice of us at all. Much to my relief, he never once acknowledged my presence, nor gave any indication that he recognized me from that day on the beach. None of us knew his name, not even Jim, so we started referring to him using the mock Indian name of Last Man Standing, this for his penchant for being the last one to come off the rocks when the tide got too high. Despite our general apprehension at his presence, we had to admit that he cut quite a figure in person. He was a giant of a man, sporting old patched-up red ball waders and a smelly oilskin parka cinched at the waist with some sort of animal-skin belt. His long black hair was pulled back and braided, with only a tinge of gray around the temple, and his face was weathered and worn, yet strangely ageless. He was a truly impressive specimen of human manhood in the form of a vagabond fisherman. The only equipment we ever saw him use was an old 11-foot or so glass rod with most of the guides held on by black electrical tape. To this he had attached a beat-up old Penn Beachmaster or Squidder, hard to tell from the distances we kept. And he threw huge plugs, the type of which we could not readily identify. Yet despite his ramshackle appearance, he seemed to have an uncanny knack for catching big fish, and this simple fact did not escape our notice. As word of his fishing prowess spread, he became a frequent topic of discussion among our group. When we weren't fishing, or tending to our personal or professional lives, we would often wind up at Jim's comparing notes on where he had fished and what he had caught. Despite our growing interest in his fish-catching abilities, there were still a few of the regulars that didn't take to what they felt was an intrusion on their turf. One of those was Big Will McCarty. Like his name implied, Will was a big man, with a hot Irish temper to match. He worked on and off for a local contractor, and had a well-earned reputation for being a hard-ass. He often griped about how he was going to put a plug in the back of the Indian's head, that for always standing on a rock in front of where he was casting. It took a while for their paths to cross up close and personal, and I'll never forget what happened when they finally did. That day happened to be a pleasant Saturday afternoon in early October. Myself and a few other guys were shooting the breeze at Jim's after the incoming tide had chased us off our rocks, when Big Will blew in through the door. He was obviously agitated and started right in. "He did it again! I can't believe that son of a bitch did it to me again." Already knowing what this was about, I asked anyway. "Who did what to who, Will?" "That freaking Indian," he said. "He stood on the rock out front of the one I always fish on in Jacob's Cove. That's the third time this week. I tell you, he's really starting to piss me off." As he stood there continuing his rant with his back to the door, he was not able to see what had caught our attention. For a giant, he walked very quietly, no doubt some leftover ancestral skill from his Indian heritage. He stood just inside the door for a few moments, listening to Big Will's ranting, before walking over to the wall and picking a spool of Dacron off the rack. He then walked right past us and the still ranting Will to the register area at the back counter to pay. Jim stood there looking like a deer in the headlights as I held my breath for what was coming next. It took a second for Will's synapses to kick in, and when they did, his mouth froze in mid-speech. For several seconds, everybody simply stopped moving, and in that stone-cold silence you could have heard a bird fart. Jim was the first to flinch. "That'll be $2.99, please," he said. As the Indian was pulling out a small pouch from inside his old oilskin parka, Will's synapses went into overdrive. "Hey, how come you always stand on that rock in front of me?" he demanded loudly. The Indian paused momentarily as if considering the question or what his next move should be. Will's agitated voice went up a notch. "I asked you a question. How come you always stand on that rock?" Replacing the pouch in his parka, the Indian slowly stood to his full height, turned, and walked over to face Will squarely. Standing more than a full head taller than Will, he looked down directly into Will's eyes. After no more than a few seconds, Will's defiant expression began to wilt, and we all saw something none of us ever thought we would ever see. Big Will McCarty, standing there, looking for all the world like he was going to piss himself. Because that is where the fish are. We had never heard him speak before. His voice was soft, even, and without a hint of malice. Oddly out of place considering the circumstances. He returned to the counter and paid Jim for the fishing line before continuing. Turning his attention to Will again, he asked, "Is possession of that rock something that is important to you?" Will, who seemed to be struggling to recover from whatever it was that had just blindsided him, simply nodded his head. "Then perhaps there is another way to resolve this conflict without resorting to the violence you so wish upon me," he said. "You and the others in this room refer to me as last man standing. Is this not so?" Our eyes scurried around, trying to figure out how he knew this and who had let the cat out of the bag. "Perhaps we can put that to the test," he said. He went on to propose that on the following day, Will and himself should meet at the cove and take up positions on a rock of Will's choosing at 2 p.m., right around mid-incoming. As the tide rises, the last man able to keep his position on the rock wins the contest and gets sole possession of the rocks in that cove. "Is this agreeable to you?" he asked Will. With a small portion of his former defiance returning, and sensing an opportunity to redeem himself, Will quickly agreed.